He was supposed to be just a stranger I shared rent with, nothing more. I didn't expect his laughter to echo in my chest long after it faded, or the way his smile could break through even my worst days. And I never imagined that one quiet night, when the world was still and I was half asleep, I'd feel the warmth of him slipping under my blanket, close enough that I could hear his heartbeat. That was the moment everything changed, and I couldn't pretend it was just friendship anymore. When I first moved into the apartment, I told myself this was just about having a roof over my head and splitting the rent. Nothing more, nothing complicated. But from the very first evening, there was something about him that felt different. He greeted me at the door with this easy smile that didn't feel forced, the kind of smile that reached his eyes and made me forget for a second that I was nervous about living with a stranger. His voice had a calmness to it, warm and steady, and when he asked if I needed help with my boxes, it wasn't out of politeness, it felt genuine. I didn't want to read too much into it, but I remember watching him grab the heavier one without a word, carrying it down the hallway as if it weighed nothing, and I caught myself noticing the shape of his shoulders under his shirt. I quickly looked away, reminding myself this was just my new roommate, not someone I should be staring at. The first night was simple. We ordered pizza because neither of us had the energy to cook, and we sat on the couch surrounded by unpacked boxes. He leaned back casually, feet propped on the coffee table, and told me little things about himself, where he grew up, how he hated his last job, how he loved staying up late just to watch movies. I listened more than I spoke, half because I was exhausted and half because I liked the sound of his voice. It had this rhythm that made me feel like the room was softer, calmer, like I could breathe easier. Every now and then our eyes would meet, and he'd give this quick grin before looking away again. It wasn't anything big, but I noticed it. I noticed everything. Living with him quickly fell into a rhythm. He brewed coffee every morning before I even woke up, filling the apartment with that rich smell, and sometimes he'd leave a mug for me on the counter without saying anything. He wasn't loud, he wasn't messy, he wasn't the kind of roommate who demanded attention, yet somehow he had a presence that filled every corner of the apartment. Even when he was in his room, I was aware of him. The sound of his laughter when he talked on the phone with his friends. The way he hummed under his breath when he cooked. The shuffle of his footsteps late at night when he grabbed water. It was as if the silence itself carried pieces of him, and I found myself listening for them more often than I wanted to admit. One evening, we sat together watching some show I barely paid attention to. He stretched out, his arm resting along the back of the couch, and for a second it felt like it was behind me, almost around me. I sat a little straighter, suddenly aware of the space between us, or maybe the lack of it. The glow from the TV lit his face in soft blues and whites, and when he laughed at something on screen, I caught myself laughing too, not because it was funny, but because I wanted to share in the sound of it. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just normal roommate stuff, but when he leaned a little closer to point at something, I felt a spark shoot through me like static, sharp and undeniable. I couldn't stop thinking about it after at night, lying in bed, I replayed the smallest things. The brush of his shoulder when we passed each other in the hallway. The way his eyes softened when he said goodnight. The way he leaned in the doorway of the kitchen, sipping his drink like he had nowhere else in the world to be. These weren't supposed to matter. I told myself it was just because we were living in close quarters, that my mind was exaggerating normal interactions, that I was lonely and reading too much into kindness. But deep down, I knew I was noticing him in ways I hadn't noticed anyone in a long time. And the more I tried to push the thought away, the more it stayed. It lingered like the faint smell of his cologne after he walked past, or the echo of his laughter that seemed to follow me even when I was alone in my room. I didn't realize it then, but those early days were already shaping something I wouldn't be able to ignore. Every small glance, every word we exchanged, every accidental touch, each one was a piece of something bigger. I thought I was just settling into a new home, but what I was really doing was stepping into the beginning of a story I wasn't ready for, a story that would change me in ways I didn't expect. The days slowly began to blend into each other, and before I even noticed, he was no longer just my new roommate but a part of my routine. We had this unspoken rhythm that felt natural, almost as if we had been living together for years instead of just a couple of weeks. He would come home from work with that tired look in his eyes, toss his bag onto the chair by the door, and then find me either in the kitchen or sprawled on the couch. Without even asking, he would sink down beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body near mine, and we'd start talking about nothing and everything. Some evenings we cooked together, fumbling through recipes neither of us really knew but laughing the whole way through. He would chop vegetables in this steady, careful way, and sometimes he would pass me a slice to taste, holding it out so close that my fingers brushed his as I took it. The smallest contact sent ripples through me, but I tried to laugh it off like it didn't matter. The apartment itself began to feel alive with our shared energy. Music drifted from the kitchen while we cleaned, the sound of our voices carried through the hallway, and even silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. There were nights when we just sat in the living room, both of us scrolling through our phones, not saying much, but the presence of him sitting there, breathing the same quiet air, was enough to make me feel less alone than I had in a long time. It was strange how quickly he became the comfort I didn't know I was searching for. And with that comfort came an awareness I couldn't shut off. I started to notice the little quirks about him, the way his hair stuck up in the mornings, the way he cracked his knuckles absent-mindedly when he was lost in thought, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled at something stupid I said. They weren't extraordinary things, but to me they became details I couldn't stop memorizing. One night, we ordered Chinese takeout because neither of us felt like cooking. We sat cross-legged on the floor with the containers spread out between us. He teased me for not being able to handle the spicy noodles, and I teased him back for drowning everything in soy sauce. At some point, I looked up at him while he was laughing, chopsticks in his hand, and the sight hit me in a way I couldn't explain. My chest tightened, and for a split second, it was like the world dimmed around us. I quickly looked back down, pretending to focus on my food, but my mind kept circling back to that moment, replaying it like a song stuck on repeat. The physical space between us seemed to shrink over time, not because we forced it, but because it just happened. On the couch, our shoulders brushed when we sat too close. In the kitchen, we bumped into each other while moving around the counters. Sometimes, when I passed him something, his fingers lingered against mine just a little too long. None of it was dramatic, none of it was spoken about, but each small touch felt louder than words, like secret conversations our bodies were having while our mouths stayed silent. I told myself it was harmless, that maybe I was just imagining things. But at night, when I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the way my stomach fluttered when he smiled at me, or the way my skin burned where his hand had brushed mine. There was a softness about him that pulled me in without effort, and I was caught between wanting more and being terrified of what more could mean. I had never let myself think too deeply about someone like this before, and yet with him, it didn't feel like a choice. It felt inevitable. There was a moment late one evening, when we sat watching a movie neither of us was really invested in. He leaned back against the couch, arms stretched casually across the top, and I shifted slightly closer, so close that his sleeve brushed against my shoulder. Neither of us moved away. The movie played on, but I couldn't hear a word of it. All I could focus on was how near he was, how his breathing sounded, how the warmth of his arm made me feel like my own heartbeat was louder than the dialogue on screen. He didn't say anything, and neither did I, but that silence carried more weight than any conversation we'd had. It was in that quiet space between us that I realized something had already begun to change, whether I was ready for it or not. It was late, one of those nights when the world outside felt impossibly quiet, as if everything had slowed down to make space for thoughts you didn't want to confront. I had gone to bed early, or at least I pretended to. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint creaks of the apartment, the hum of the fridge, and most of all the soft, distant sounds of him moving around in the living room. Every little noise reminded me that he was there, only a few steps away, and it made my chest feel both heavy and restless. I turned over, pulled the blanket tighter around me, and tried to force myself into sleep. My body wanted rest, but my mind kept circling back to him, the sound of his laughter from earlier, the way his arm brushed mine when he reached for the remote, the easy way he looked at me that made me feel like I mattered. I told myself again and again to stop thinking about it, to push it away before it grew too big, but denial didn't quiet the ache in my chest. Sometime past midnight, when I was drifting on the edge of sleep, I felt the mattress shift. At first, I thought I was dreaming. The bed dipped slightly, the blanket tugged, and then there was warmth beside me that hadn't been there before. My eyes snapped open, and in the dim glow from the streetlight slipping through the curtains, I could just make out his outline. He had slid into the bed as if it were the most natural thing in the world. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, unsure if I should move, speak, or pretend I was still asleep. The silence was thick, broken only by the sound of his breathing, steady and calm, so close I could feel it against my skin. My heart pounded so hard I was afraid it would give me away. Every part of me was screaming with awareness, the heat of his body only inches from mine, the faint brush of his legs shifting under the blanket, the weight of the air between us that felt charged and alive. I wanted to turn and look at him, to ask why, to demand an explanation, but my voice was stuck somewhere deep in my chest. Instead, I stared up into the dark, trying to make sense of the moment. Maybe he was half asleep, maybe he had a nightmare, maybe this was nothing at all. But it didn't feel like nothing. It felt like everything I had been trying to ignore had suddenly stepped into the open, heavy and undeniable. The minutes stretched endlessly, each second making me more aware of how close we were. I could hear the subtle shift of fabric when he moved, the almost imperceptible sigh he let out as if settling in. And then there was a pause, a stillness, and for a terrifying, exhilarating moment I wondered if he was as awake as I was, lying there with the same rush of thoughts, the same quickened pulse, the same question hanging between us. I kept my eyes fixed on the ceiling, terrified that if I moved, I would shatter the fragile balance of the moment. It would have been easy to slide away, to create distance, to pretend I was uncomfortable and end the confusion right there. But I didn't. I stayed still, caught in the gravity of his presence. My body betrayed me, leaning slightly closer, inch by inch, as if drawn to him without permission. The warmth from his body seeped into mine, and even without touching, I felt the connection, raw and undeniable. Every nerve was alive, every breath felt deeper, and the silence between us screamed louder than any words could. At some point, I closed my eyes, but sleep was impossible. My thoughts spun in restless circles. Why did he come here? What did it mean? Was this a mistake, or was this the moment I had been waiting for without even realizing it? Fear tangled with hope, and hope tangled with something deeper, something I didn't dare name. The questions pressed hard against my chest, but underneath them was one simple truth I could no longer hide from: I didn't want him to leave. I didn't want this closeness to end. I lay there for hours, listening to his steady breathing, feeling the weight of his presence next to me. The night felt suspended, as if the world outside had disappeared, leaving just the two of us in that small, shared space. And though nothing was said, though no bold moves were made, something had shifted forever. The boundary that once felt clear between us had blurred, and in the quiet darkness, with his body resting beside mine, I realized there was no way to go back to how things were before. The morning after that night felt heavier than usual, like the air itself carried the weight of what had happened, or maybe what hadn't. I woke up before him, still frozen in the same spot I had fallen asleep in, careful not to move too much, terrified of what it would mean if I acknowledged the closeness of the night before. He was still beside me, his breathing soft and even, the warmth of him lingering under the same blanket. For a moment, I allowed myself to simply look at him, his hair messy, his face relaxed in sleep, and I felt something inside me ache with a tenderness I hadn't allowed myself to feel fully until now. But as soon as he stirred, shifting slightly with a faint groan, I panicked. I slipped out of bed quietly, my heart racing, and escaped to the kitchen, where I stood leaning against the counter, staring at nothing, trying to calm the storm of thoughts in my head. When he finally emerged, he acted like nothing unusual had happened. His eyes were heavy with sleep, and he rubbed the back of his neck before muttering a groggy morning. He poured himself a glass of water, scratched at his hair, and didn't even hesitate, didn't even look embarrassed. It was almost infuriating, how casual he seemed when my entire body was trembling with questions. Did he remember? Did it mean nothing? Was it comfort, or was it something else entirely? I wanted to ask, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I forced a smile, forced my voice into steadiness, and said something stupid about the weather. He smiled back, and that was it. The conversation died, leaving behind a silence that buzzed with all the things I couldn't bring myself to say. The rest of the day, I couldn't stop watching him differently. Every glance, every move, every word felt amplified. I caught myself studying his hands as he reached for a mug, the casual way he leaned against the wall when we talked, the way his laughter filled the apartment like it had always belonged there. I kept trying to remind myself to breathe, to act normal, but my mind kept replaying the night again and again. The quiet shift of the mattress, the warmth of him beside me, the way his presence filled every inch of the silence. It was like my body had been branded by that closeness, and now I couldn't escape it. That evening, we ended up cooking dinner together, and it was almost unbearable how normal it all seemed. He chopped onions while I stirred the pan, and our shoulders bumped more than once. He laughed when I swore at the onions, making my eyes water, and he leaned in with that same easy charm to hand me a towel. Our fingers touched, and I swear I felt a spark shoot through me. I froze for a second, holding onto the fabric, staring at his hand longer than I should have. He didn't pull away quickly, instead, his eyes flicked up to mine, holding them just a little too long. It wasn't obvious, not enough to mean anything for sure, but it was enough to leave me spiraling again. Later, as we sat eating on the couch, I noticed how he sat close, not close enough for anyone else to think twice about, but close enough for me to feel his presence as a constant hum under my skin. I tried to focus on the food, on the show playing on the screen, but my eyes kept drifting to him, to the way his lips curled as he chewed thoughtfully, to the soft curve of his smile when he caught something funny. And then, as if he had felt my gaze, he turned his head and looked right at me. My chest tightened. It wasn't a long look, maybe a second or two, but it felt like an eternity stretched between us. I looked away quickly, my cheeks burning, but the silence that followed felt heavier than any conversation we could have had. That night, when I went to bed, I lay awake again, staring at the ceiling, my body restless with thoughts I couldn't contain. I wanted to know what was going on in his head, whether the night before had meant anything, whether these touches and glances were accidents or something more. I thought about the way he had climbed into my bed like it was natural, like it wasn't something to question. I thought about how safe I had felt with him lying there, even through my confusion and fear. And underneath all of that, there was this growing desire, an ache not just for closeness, but for clarity, for something real. As the hours passed, I realized I couldn't keep going like this forever. Pretending nothing had changed while my heart was practically breaking under the weight of wanting him was tearing me apart. Every laugh we shared, every small touch, every quiet moment together only drew me deeper in. I told myself I could be strong, that I could hold back, that it was safer not to risk anything. But the truth was, I was already too far gone. And no matter how hard I tried to fight it, I knew I didn't just want his presence beside me anymore, I wanted him. All of him. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope, every step balanced between what I wanted to believe and what I feared to admit. Nothing had been said about that night, and outwardly everything appeared the same: shared meals, late-night conversations, the casual comfort of living together, but beneath the surface, something had undeniably shifted. It was in the way my chest tightened whenever he entered the room, in the way my eyes searched for him even when I pretended they weren't, in the way silence between us carried a weight I could no longer dismiss. I began to notice every detail with an intensity that almost scared me. The way he laughed, soft and unguarded, felt like sunlight spilling into corners I didn't know were dark. The way his hand brushed mine when we passed something across the table made my pulse race like I was a teenager again. I told myself I was imagining it, that he didn't mean anything by it, but the truth was I didn't care anymore. I wanted those moments, and I wanted them desperately. One evening we sat together in the living room, a movie playing quietly in the background. He sprawled across the couch, his leg brushing mine every so often, and though it could have been accidental, he didn't move it away. I sat frozen, caught between leaning into the contact or pulling back, and the indecision was eating me alive. He reached over at one point to grab the remote, his arm grazing against my chest, and my breath stilled in my throat. I don't think he noticed how stiff I went, or maybe he did and chose not to say anything. He just settled back into the couch, his body comfortably close to mine, like this was the most natural thing in the world. And maybe for him it was. But for me, every second felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, both terrified and exhilarated at what might happen if I dared to jump. As the night grew quieter, the conversation turned softer. He asked me about my family, about my childhood, and I found myself telling him stories I rarely shared with anyone. There was something about the way he listened, really listened, that made me feel safe enough to open up. His eyes didn't drift away, his expression didn't grow impatient, he just sat there, leaning slightly closer, like every word I said mattered. At one point, when I stumbled over something painful, his hand rested briefly on mine. It was gentle, not lingering, but it sent a shock through me that I couldn't disguise. I looked down at our hands, then back at his face, and for a second the world went completely still. He withdrew slowly, almost hesitantly, and I couldn't help but wonder if he felt the same spark I did. Nights like that kept happening. Sometimes we would stay up too late, talking until our words slurred with exhaustion. Sometimes we didn't need words at all, just sitting in silence, both of us scrolling on our phones but leaning against each other as though our bodies had decided closeness was no longer negotiable. The more it happened, the harder it became for me to convince myself this was ordinary. No, there was something here, something unspoken but alive, something I was both terrified of and drawn to with every fiber of my being. The hardest part was the mornings. I would wake up and find myself thinking about him before I even opened my eyes. I'd listen for the sound of the coffee machine, the shuffle of his feet in the hallway, and the moment he stepped into the kitchen, I felt myself come alive in a way I didn't know how to explain. Watching him move through the apartment had become my favorite part of the day. He wasn't doing anything special, just pouring coffee, adjusting his shirt, running a hand through his messy hair, but I was memorizing him piece by piece, as though I could hold on to these little moments in case everything fell apart. And yet, with every passing day, the silence grew heavier. I wanted to tell him. I wanted to lean across the couch one evening and just say it, that I couldn't stop thinking about him, that I didn't want this to just be friendship, that I wanted something more. But every time the words came close to leaving my mouth, fear silenced them. Fear of ruining what we had. Fear of losing the comfort of his presence. Fear that maybe I had misread everything, and it was only me who felt this pull between us. That fear clung to me like a shadow, keeping me trapped in a cycle of wanting and denying, aching and pretending. But even in my silence, my body betrayed me. I leaned into his touch more than I should have, lingered in the kitchen when he was there, stayed awake later just to sit near him. There was one night when we ended up sitting on the balcony again, the city lights glowing faintly in the distance. He handed me a drink, and our fingers brushed longer than necessary. Neither of us pulled away this time. We just sat there, the contact small but steady, and my heart raced so fast I was sure he could hear it. The air between us was thick with something I couldn't define, and though no words were spoken, I knew we were both aware of it. Something had shifted again, deeper, stronger, undeniable. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized I could no longer fool myself into thinking this was temporary. The truth had already taken root, growing stronger with each passing day. I wanted him, not just as my roommate, not just as my friend, but as something more. I wanted the warmth of his presence, the safety of his laughter, the intimacy of his touch, all of it. And though I was still afraid, though uncertainty gnawed at me, one thought pulsed louder than the fear: I was falling for him completely, and sooner or later, I would have to face what that meant. The tension between us had become impossible to ignore, though neither of us dared to speak it aloud. It was there in the pauses between our conversations, in the way our eyes lingered just a little too long, in the way our laughter sometimes faded into silences that felt charged with something unspoken. Every day I told myself to act normal, to keep the balance steady, but every day the balance slipped further away. I couldn't hide it anymore, my feelings were spilling into everything I did. When he walked past me, I inhaled his cologne without meaning to. When he laughed at something stupid, I found myself laughing harder than I should, just because his happiness made me feel light. And at night, when the apartment quieted down, I lay awake wondering what would happen if I stopped being afraid and simply told him the truth. It was a Friday evening when the weight of it all finally pushed me to the edge. We had ordered takeout again, sitting cross-legged on the floor in the living room with boxes scattered around us. He was telling some ridiculous story about his coworker, his hands gesturing animatedly, and I couldn't stop watching his face. The curve of his lips when he smiled, the spark in his eyes as he spoke, it all made my chest ache with a need I couldn't contain. I realized then how exhausting it had become to keep everything bottled inside. I wanted to reach out, to take his hand and tell him I wasn't just listening to his stories because I was polite, but because I wanted to know everything about him. I wanted to tell him that every small piece of his life felt precious to me. But instead, I stayed quiet, nodding and smiling while my heart hammered with words I was too scared to release. After dinner, we ended up on the couch again, the glow of the television filling the silence. He leaned back comfortably, his leg brushing against mine, and this time I didn't shift away. I couldn't. The contact was small but overwhelming, and I found myself leaning slightly toward him, just enough to feel that I was choosing it. The moment stretched, and I could feel the pressure in my chest growing unbearable. My palms grew sweaty, my throat tight, and I knew I was standing at the edge of something. If I didn't say it now, if I didn't do something, I might lose the courage forever. I turned to him, my voice caught somewhere between fear and desperation. "Can I tell you something?" I asked, and the sound of my own words startled me. He looked at me curiously, his eyebrows lifting just slightly, and nodded. His eyes locked on mine, calm but searching, and that only made my nerves worse. My mind scrambled for the right words, but all the rehearsed speeches I had whispered to myself in the dark dissolved instantly. All I could manage was the truth, raw and unpolished. I don't think I can keep pretending this is just friendship anymore. My voice was barely above a whisper, shaking under the weight of everything I had held back. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just stared at me, and the silence was deafening. I felt my chest cave in, panic rising like a tide. Maybe I had ruined everything. Maybe I had imagined every glance, every lingering touch, every late-night closeness. My heart raced with the terror of rejection, but before I could backpedal, before I could bury the words, he shifted slightly closer. His hand brushed mine, not by accident this time, but deliberately, slowly, like he was asking permission without words. The air between us grew thick, and my body felt like it was burning from the inside out. I wanted to speak again, to explain, to beg him not to pull away, but I couldn't find the words. All I could do was hold his gaze, my entire world hanging on the look in his eyes. His touch lingered, warm and steady, and I knew this moment had already changed everything. My confession was out in the open, fragile and trembling, and there was no taking it back. That night, as the hours stretched on, we stayed close, neither of us moving far from the other. I didn't know yet what his answer would be, didn't know if he felt the same way or if I had just stepped over a line we could never return from. But in that fragile silence, with his hand resting against mine and his eyes never quite leaving me, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once, and even though I had no idea what tomorrow would bring, I knew one thing for certain: the truth was finally out, and nothing would ever be the same again. The silence after my confession stretched on like an eternity, and every second felt heavier than the last. My heart raced so fast I thought it might burst, and I was seconds away from pulling back, from apologizing, from pretending none of this had ever happened. But then he finally spoke, his voice soft, almost uncertain, as though he was afraid his words might shatter me. "I was waiting for you to say that," he whispered, and those 7 words rewrote everything inside me. It felt like my lungs filled for the first time in months, like the weight I had been carrying had finally been lifted. I stared at him in disbelief, unsure if I had heard him right, but then he smiled in that quiet way of his, the kind of smile that carried truth, and my fear dissolved into something I had no control over: relief, joy, and the kind of longing that could no longer be denied. I didn't know what to do next, so I just sat there, frozen, my fingers twitching against his. But he made the choice for me. His hand slid into mine, steady and deliberate, and I could feel the warmth of his skin seeping into me, grounding me in a moment that felt both unreal and inevitable. My breath caught in my throat as he leaned closer, closing the distance between us with a slowness that gave me every chance to pull away, though I knew I never would. When his lips finally brushed mine, it wasn't rushed or desperate. It was soft, tentative, like a promise spoken without words. The world outside the walls of our apartment ceased to exist. There was no past, no fear of what might come, only him, only us, only the quiet magic of finally being seen and wanted. When we pulled apart, the silence was different now. It wasn't heavy with unspoken feelings or restrained desires. It was calm, filled with the comfort of knowing we had both stepped into the same truth. His eyes searched mine, as though making sure I was okay, and I couldn't help but laugh softly, a shaky, nervous laugh that came from pure relief. I thought I was going crazy, I admitted, my voice unsteady but freer than it had been in weeks. He shook his head, smiling gently, and replied, "No. You were just waiting for me, the same way I was waiting for you." The days that followed were nothing like before, and yet everything felt more natural than I could have imagined. The smallest things changed, waking up to find him already making coffee, and now he'd hand me a mug with a smile that lingered longer than it used to, sitting on the couch at night, our shoulders no longer brushing by accident but leaning intentionally into each other, walking through the city together, no longer wondering if anyone noticed the closeness between us because, for once, I didn't care. There was no script for this, no guidebook on how to transition from roommates to something so much deeper, but it didn't matter. Every moment we shared wrote its own story, and I found myself wanting nothing more than to keep turning the pages with him. Of course, there were fears that lingered in the background. What if this complicated things? What if it didn't last? What if we hurt each other in ways we couldn't repair? Those thoughts crept in late at night, whispering doubts into the quiet. But every time I looked at him, every time he reached for me without hesitation, those fears faded. Because love, I realized, wasn't about certainty. It was about choosing someone every day, even when the future was unclear. And I knew, as surely as I knew my own name, that I would choose him. One evening, we ended up on the balcony again, sitting close with the city lights glowing faintly in the distance. He rested his head against my shoulder, and I wrapped an arm around him, pulling him closer. For the first time, there was no hesitation in the gesture, no question of whether it was too much. It was exactly where we both wanted to be. The cool night air wrapped around us, but his warmth kept me grounded, and in that quiet stillness, I felt something settle inside me. Not just love, but peace, the kind of peace that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be. I thought back to the night he first climbed into my bed, how confusing and terrifying it had been, how I had struggled with the weight of what it might mean. Now, sitting there with his hand intertwined with mine, I realized that moment had been the start of something neither of us had the courage to name at the time. It wasn't just about desire or loneliness. It was about connection, about finding in each other the kind of closeness we had both been searching for without knowing it. That night had changed everything, even if it took us weeks to admit it. As the days turned into weeks, our lives wove together more tightly. The routines we had built as roommates became something richer, something filled with tenderness and intention. Every shared meal, every lazy morning, every quiet night felt like a small piece of a larger story we were only beginning to write. And though I didn't know what the future held, I no longer felt afraid of it. Because whatever came next, I wouldn't be facing it alone. He was more than my roommate now, more than my friend. He was the person I had been waiting for, the one who turned ordinary days into something extraordinary simply by being in them. And as I held him close on that balcony, listening to the rhythm of his breathing against me, I knew with absolute certainty that this was only the beginning.